In Australia, 1 in 4 pregnancies end in miscarriage, 1 in 100 are ectopic, and thousands of babies are born still each year. Child loss during pregnancy is utterly devastating for the people who experience it, and despite being so common, the grief that follows often remains hidden. This is especially true for men who can feel obligated to suppress their own distress in order to stay strong for their partner, unintentionally sidelining the magnitude of their own loss. Through her work as a clinical psychologist and CEO of Perinatal Anxiety and Depression Australia, Julie Borninkhof has dedicated her career to supporting people through pregnancy loss, postnatal depression and anxiety, and the quiet, often unseen struggles that many parents face. In this episode, we chat about what it's really like for men to lose a child, the isolation, the strain on relationships, and the pressure to move on too quickly. We explore why so many men struggle to give themselves permission to grieve and where to begin to process a loss like this. Julie blends clinical insight with human understanding, and she might have some of the answers you're looking for. This is Julie Borninkhof.
Welcome to Young Blood, the volunteer video podcast dedicated to young men's mental health. I'm your host, Cal McPherson, and this is a platform for young men and their loved ones to share lived experience stories and show that no matter what you're going through, you're not alone. Suicide is the #1 killer of young people, and changing that starts with speaking up. So let's do it. This show touches on some tough topics that may provoke strong emotions. If you find anything in this chat distressing, please do whatever you need to do to look after yourself.
Julie, we don't often hear about how pregnancy loss affects men. Why do you think that can be overlooked?
I think that for so many reasons, I think that there is such a focus on the person carrying the baby. I think that historically we've just been really bad at thinking about men in the scheme of their mental health and well-being. And I think the medical model that wraps around people at this time is just so focused on the well-being of the bub in the mum's tummy. And often dads just get left out at this point in time. We're getting better, but we're not there yet.
What often happens to men emotionally, internally, and even socially when they lose a child in pregnancy?
So many things. I mean, the biggest thing when I reflect as a psychologist, but also as a parent and somebody who has a really open relationship and loving relationship with their partner and's kind of spoken through the quirks and foibles of parenting, I think the biggest thing is the identity shift that happens as we become pregnant and, carrying the baby, whether you're the dad walking beside their partner or the mum. There's such a shift in identity, and any loss during that period is a complete disruption, regardless of how prepared you were for that new role. And, it's a phenomenal impact in terms of disrupting that identity, throwing you on a completely different trajectory where you had to kind of be planning in advance for this new bub and now be in a space where you don't have that new bub and you have to kind of reset and you have to give yourself time to grieve. So it's a very tricky time.
Why do you think men tend to set their grief aside?
I think it's hard as a woman to talk to, but, I think from the experience I have in talking to men as a psychologist, but also that we hear from our helpline and from my mates, I think that men are so focused on the transactional pieces that they are tasked with day to day. There are these really heavy loads that men feel that they need to be carrying to support their families. There is this incredible kind of feeling that they're responsible for so much when their partner is carrying the bub. And we know that the impact of that means that sometimes people don't process grief or their mental health during this time because they're just so focused on being the rock for the family. But, as I always say, even rocks crumble and, men need to take time. They need to feel what it is they're going through, good and bad, And for some, there are these feelings that are really kind of strange that are a sense of relief, perhaps, that, I wasn't ready for this or I didn't know how to be a dad. And then they beat themselves up for feeling those things. It's a petri dish and a smorgasbord of all different things.
Is it common with the men that you've spoken to that they often feel like their pain isn't important?
Yeah. And again, I think it's that piece around, we are taught from such a young age, as women and men and every, gender in between, however you see yourselves, that, we need to minimize, we need to be tough, we need to get on with it, we need to reserve services and supports for people who may need it more. And that's a really interesting kind of phenomena that we have when ultimately you get this life once, you've got to make the most of it and you've got to be able to make it everything that you want it to be and build the family that will go on generation after generation and not put your own needs aside.
What are some of the risks associated with men feeling like they need to stay strong
Mm.
and they don't have time or they're not going to create space to process those emotions?
Yeah, look, I think, it's firstly really important to think about the fact that you don't have to delve into the hard stuff all the time and be in the thick of the emotions and the grief and the loss to be moving in the right direction. As human beings, we're kind of programmed to avoid pain at any cost. It's in us, in our DNA, in our blood. And I think it's really important to understand that there are times when you need to feel functional and where you need to kind of put that stuff aside and kind of feel normal. And there are times where you do need to stop and reflect and really feel and own what it is you're going through, so that you are able to reflect on where you're at. And it's different every day, any loss of self. So, for people who may have lost a baby, that's kind of one end of the spectrum. Whereas for somebody who has experienced mental health, has lost a sense of identity and a sense of stability in their life. So we grieve in different ways.
How do we know when it's time to do what? How do I know when it's time to process my emotions and sit in the grief versus not think about it right now and do something else? Like,
Such a good question. And look, I don't think there's a right or a wrong to that. I think it goes back to what I said before about the fact that, you get one crack at life, and when your life feels like it isn't your own, like there's this kind of unwelcome visitor of, grief or loss or mental vulnerability that makes you feel less than whatever it is when you feel capable, less than a father, less than a man, less than a partner, at that point where you're able to kind of say, hey, there's something going on for me and I don't feel normal, or I don't like where I'm at right now, or I'm hearing people tell me that I'm not myself. That is just so important that people take that as a sign to put themselves first. And that's really hard. It's really hard.
talk about the step of acknowledging the loss in the first place and
Mm.
before we can process it, or at the start is actually acknowledging it that that's real and
Mm.
it unfortunately isn't going to change.
Yeah. Look, I think again, I can't give clear answers because, I think loss and acknowledging loss can come in so many different ways. And I know with, clients I've worked with personally outside of PANDA, but also from the stories that we are, honoured to kind of hear and support people around, that, the acknowledgement comes through so many different channels, whether it's sitting and watching your partner grieve and not yet having that feeling heavy within yourself, whether it's somebody telling you, you must be feeling this way because you've just lost your bub, and you're kind of going, oh, hang on, yeah, I do feel that way, and connecting with that experience, or whether you're just really in the thick of it and kind of being floored by the fact that this feeling of loss and this feeling of emptiness and this feeling of kind of echo chamber, where things kind of don't touch you, but they bounce around you and bounce off you. I think they're all different ways of acknowledging. And I think that some days it can feel that you're kind of moving through a grief process and that you are kind of getting somewhere and you're getting closer to understanding and it being concrete. And then that can go 10 steps back the next day, when you kind of take on a different mindset and start to reflect on what you had hoped for or what you were building with your partner. So, grief is a bit of a dance. It kind of moves back and forth, and some days you're feeling a bit better than others. And it takes so much to get through that.
And it's not linear. And an important
No.
part of it is not beating yourself up when you felt like you were progressing and you had a good day and you thought, okay, I'm getting better, I'm feeling happier. And then you had a bad day because something reminded you of it or whatever happened. Life's already hard enough without you beating yourself up for not being over it
Completely.
fast enough.
Yeah. And we're our worst critics, at the end of the day. Most of us are our worst critics because we do constantly kind of, take a position that, I'm faulty because I'm not doing this, or, I was so much better yesterday, or, I could go to work yesterday. Today, I just want to crawl under the doona and kind of not get back out. And I think you just got to go easy on yourself. It's in the same way you would have taught your bub to walk. We learn to get through anything one step at a time, and the little steps are the most stabilizing. So, I really do recommend that people don't hold themselves up to a benchmark. Don't ever feel that they're not going through a process of grief or loss or recovery, whatever that means. Because how do you recover from any loss? I think it's really important that you don't hold yourself to a standard, and that you just understand that your experience is valid. You are worthy, you are worthy of help, but you're also worthy of time and the time it takes to get through this journey.
And where is that benchmark or that standard actually coming from? And is it real, or is it something that we tell ourselves, we compare ourselves to some idea of what we think we should be or where we should be up to, and not sure perhaps where we actually get that idea from. But having gone through grief myself, but not for this, but you can set this standard, and it's kind of like you just assume that's what you're supposed to be going as fast as possible. It's been a week now, it's been a month now, it's been a year now, it should be over this by now. But it's like, okay, but who says who?
Yeah,
like, where
exactly.
are we getting that from?
Yeah. Well, I think we get it from so many sources. And I think where are we not getting it from as well is an important question when I think about, mental health and mental well-being, not just mental ill health. But when we think about mental well-being and your mental well-being in any situation, including loss, I think we're just really bad at talking about how fluid it is, how changeable it is. And, that really floors the best of people when they go through it. And I think then on the flip side of that, we're really good at showing, these smiley, happy families that, in social media, and we're really good at kind of projecting a family unit in a certain way that you kind of go into being pregnant blind, that these kind of things can happen and that you can lose a little one, or that you can have a really traumatic time and not cope well or feel that you're a good dad. And I think that's the role, and that's the work that I love to do, and why it's so great to have this conversation, because it's these that one brick at a time kind of build a wall of reality around how we can be different.
But it's actually so incredibly common, which is the other thing. And I think generally as a society, when we think about pregnancy, or the way it's marketed or viewed, is this beautiful, wonderful time for all involved. And it ticks along as it's meant to, and then a baby comes out, and that baby's happy and healthy, and then you're parents and you start that next chapter of your life. But the statistics for miscarriage and ectopic pregnancy and stillbirth are very high. It happens a high percentage of the time, but we're not seeing nearly as many stories of that, of course, because it's so painful and people are reticent to share it, compared to the, okay, everything went according to plan. And so when it doesn't go according to plan, I think that gives people a tendency to think, well, that must be my fault. I must be malfunctioning in some way.
And aren't we amazing at kind of making ourselves the failures in all of this? I think that that's so important, and it is human nature, regardless of whether you're a man or a woman. I think we are just really good at self-referencing when we don't hit those sort of societal norms and milestones. But the reality, as you said, considering all of the kind of nuances and kind of alignments of things that need to go well to have a really healthy baby, and the fact that you're within a system that, supports you in so many different ways with so many moving parts. We, are all so lucky for where we have healthy children to be able to have those and cherish those, But the reality is, as you said, so many people do lose bubs, and, that is a normal part of life for many, because many people lose multiple children and they come out the other side, they carry a hole and they carry a grief throughout their life, and it's kind of woven into the tapestry of who they are. But that can make their life richer when they honour that part of themselves and their loss, but it's still really hard to get through.
What have men said to you about what it's like for them to support their partners going through this kind of loss and feel like they have to hold it all together for their
Again,
partner.
yeah, again, I think some men kind of feel this sense of relief because it meant that they didn't have to go near their own feelings and their experience, because they had to be strong for their partner and, that felt safe at the time. But what generally happens is that they hit a wall in terms of having to deal with that later, and that can be really overwhelming. Um,
What can that look like and how it manifests?
So quite often when it does manifest, that the experience for men can be, complete disengagement from their social communities, complete isolation and lockdown, not knowing how to process things, feeling that they are not able to function in the places that felt safe, like their workplace, if they hold, a career that feels, or a role that feels known, feeling that they're not worthy of the things that they have in life, and we know that so many men, this flips then into mental health or, mental ill health that feels like they just get locked in this vortex of anxiety and depression, and for some people, feelings of suicide as a result of just kind of stop the world, I want to get off, and it's important that we understand that that experience is so different for everyone, but ultimately for men, we know that it can kind of spectrum to feeling like they want to be taking on risk-taking behaviours to feel that they do have a life to be living and that they do have a world that they can be engaging with, right through to kind of blocking the world out. And no one loss looks the same as the other because it's a unique experience. And it kind of depends on what I always call the backpack of crap of things that you carry through life, I mean, if you've had losses early on in your life or trauma, if you've had, no kind of stable parent lineage that's kind of showing you how to be a parent and navigate these tough times. And we know for men that it is even more difficult. But I think, if you're somebody looking after a mate during this time or, you're watching your partner struggle, you want to be looking out for the things that just don't look normal. And, that might be doing too much of something or it might mean doing too little of it and kind of withdrawing.
What do you say to men who feel guilty or carry shame around this?
I think that that's a really valid experience to have and that you're not alone in having that experience. But carrying guilt and shame, feelings that, we're putting on ourselves that become barriers to us actually feeling like we are enough and able to get support for things, the guilt that somebody feels is taking on more than is theirs to take on at the end of the day. So it's a really catastrophic sort of thought that will become overwhelming. I think, in moderation, there's always things, we might do differently, but getting into a space where you can't separate yourself from that thought and to a space where it becomes unhealthy and becomes overwhelming is a space where you really need to be getting support as early as you can.
And that mental torment, we're doing it to ourselves. Of course, there's the external thing. There's the external thing that has happened, the reality, which we wish didn't happen. But then the torturing yourself over it again and again and again. We actually do have some control over that. How
Yeah.
can we start to get some relief or let ourselves off the hook a bit without feeling more guilty for wanting to do that?
Or more like a failure. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Look, I think it's a hard one. And, I think, well, I don't think I know that for the men that reach out to our helpline, I think they've tried to overthink things often. People and women do it as well. We want to kind of come to support and help seeking, knowing what it is we need to be asking help for. And I think quite often that holds men back from reaching out earlier because they kind of can't get a grasp or an easy handle on what it is they're experiencing. And it's
Can't
really
articulate it.
yeah, right. And so they kind of sit back on it and they sit on it and wait for it to get to a point where it's something more tangible that they can use.
And I think when you can't articulate something like that, which is very difficult to articulate, which is part of the reason why you might need some help to articulate that. But when you're struggling to even put into words what your problem is, that can make you second guess yourself and think, well,
Exactly.
it must not be a real problem because I can't even say what it is.
Yes, yes. And that's, one of the beautiful things I get to say about an organisation like PANDA, and we're really lucky to be getting some support with Pink Elephants to be able to deliver, pregnancy loss support via our helpline in the coming months. And that's a really exciting growth for us because it really is about just picking up a phone or having a conversation with a mate or a family member or a GP and not needing to know where you're going to start that conversation. and just going and saying, I don't feel great. And that's all you have to do, because then the conversation unravels in most instances. And, we have had calls and I've had sessions with clients where you kind of just sit in silence and just allow that silence to kind of build to a space where anything can be said. And that starts the journey because it's the help seeking itself. It's that reaching out for support or putting a phone number in a phone or saying to your mate at the pub, you know what, I'm not doing so good, that kicks it all off.
Well said. Can you talk about the strain that this can put on a relationship? Having a loss like this and then for a long time having that front of mind and of course you love each other often, but you see that loss when you see each other, and that's going to be a very tricky thing to navigate, I imagine. Can you speak to that?
Completely. I think, firstly, it's really important to remember that, you will both be experiencing that loss in really different ways, again, depending on what you've experienced in your life and what the loss experience was like. And just acknowledging that is really important. And, relationships are really hard work. They take lots of feeding, we need to, like sourdough, keep nurturing it, kind of look after it, and stoke it. If you're not able to give that time in many ways, and I don't mean, buying flowers and romance and all of that, but if you're not able to just be present in your relationship because you are grieving or you're not well mentally or physically, then your focus is elsewhere. And I think it's really important, if you think it, feel it, say it, is always the kind of thing that I say, because again, in relationships, we're so scared of damaging the relationship or there being a cost to the relationship in disclosing that, you may be vulnerable, that it holds you back, but you feel it. You feel that energy in a relationship. Well, for most people, they feel that energy when things are not going really well. And that tension kind of builds and builds. And the problem is, in relationships, the person takes it on as being their fault. So, if you're shutting down, it's not about you in this relationship. I'm going to go, oh, I've done something wrong. So not only am I holding this loss and blaming myself, but now I'm dodging this relationship as well. And so I think it's really important to remember that so much gets missed in the middle. And for relationships, the strongest people and the strongest partners come out of these experiences having a richer relationship than any ever for many, because they've been in the trenches with each other and it hasn't been nice. And I think, again, if we think societally, we're kind of taught we have to love this person. And the reality is that a relationship isn't about loving somebody every day. It's about some days hating things that they do, sometimes being really confronted by things that they do, sometimes being blown away by things. And relationships are about the real emotional, physical, every other part of the connection. And that doesn't have to be happy all the time. It just has to be real. So if you've lost together, your feelings of blame and shame and guilt and all of those are so valid. But just being able to share that can take the load off. And lots of people don't want to share the load because they feel like the other person's struggling, but the other person's guessing that they're the one making the other person feel bad, and the load's kind of not
So
understood.
often in an attempt to protect each other,
Yes.
I imagine, especially from the male side, I don't want to burden her. She's already going through enough, and therefore I'm going to shut down and not engage with it. And then that has the opposite effect to what often the partner would actually want, and what you actually need is to talk about whatever it is rather than just carry it around like a weight because you don't feel like it's the right thing to do to bring it up again.
Absolutely. And I think in relationships, we forget that we can fix them. Like if you, make a wrong move, or if you share something about your experience or yourself that negatively impacts the relationship one day, down the track, you can go back and mend it, because they're living things, relationships, and learning to be able to go back and say, when you asked me how I was going and I had a go at you, that wasn't about you. That you can do that at any point. You can kind of go back and reference back, and there's no kind of timestamp on these things. And that's when you're going through something like grief, that you kind of just got to get through years of putting in the hard yards and just being with that experience, being able to have those conversations are so important.
What else can you do to preserve that connection through the grieving process? Is there times where you say, okay, we have been talking about it for ad nauseum, it feels like, and hit pause on that for a while and like, let's just not talk about it or focus on it for an afternoon? Is that something people can
Absolutely.
do?
Absolutely. Yeah. And, you can do things that, get out and be in nature. You can, go and watch a movie. You can do, tissue boxing, which, I always say to couples that I've worked with, think about the things that you used to do that you used to love, write them on a scrap of paper, throw them in a tissue box, and then when times are tough, pull them out and force yourself to do them. Even if you don't feel like it and you don't have to come up with it. Any of those things are really important to do. Any space where you can reconnect with a self or a side of yourself that isn't deeply rooted in the loss experience and the role of being a dad or no longer being able to be a dad are really important. So I think that is really important to be able to do that. But most of all, I think, it's just going easy on each other.
Yeah, they're all good. How about dealing with some of those other pressures? So, say it's this happened months ago, you're still not all right, but your work very much expects you to be fully over it now and not have any bereavement time, or maybe your parents or someone else close to you doesn't have that kind of sympathy for your situation anymore and is kind of putting the pressure on to, oh, if in the case of losing a child in pregnancy, I will just try again. You know, it happens all the time. It's not that big a deal. If you're unfortunate to have that kind of commentary coming into your life, how can we respond to that?
Yeah, look, I think, grief and loss can take, 6+ years to kind of get to a space where it's not front and center and not present as much, So I think when you kind of are sitting within a few months out or even 12 months out, and you've got people writing you on what you should be doing, or how it should be looking, I think it is really fundamentally important to say, this is your journey, you own it, no one else does. And you have every right to be able to say, I'm not up to it, because that's about making this life yours. And the fact that you're not doing well just really does show, how much you had invested in this little being that you've now lost, or the identity of the family that you don't have. I think it's just really important that you take power in saying, I'm not up to it, and that's okay.
What changes when a couple goes through another pregnancy, or let's say that they're successful in having a child after having a loss? Navigating that without feeling guilt, like, they've replaced the child that they've lost
Mm.
by trying again and having another child. Like, how can they move on and have that happiness that they were searching for, but also honor the loss before?
I think, again, I would say straight out, it's really important to understand that that experience that you just explained could be so different and kind of played out in so many different ways for, each individual. I think that the first thing we know when people have lost a bub during the pregnancy period is that they're going to go through their next pregnancy period really hypervigilant. They're going to be concerned that it'll happen again. They're going to be trying to do everything they can to put in place what they should have had in place last time, knowing there is no shoulds. And so I think it's really important to just go easy on yourself and remember that that kind of feeling of being twisted up like a rubber band when you're overthinking stuff and when you're a bit anxious and stressed, that is not good. It's not healthy for you as a dad. It's not healthy for, it's just really important that people kind of try and loosen themselves up through that period. And then I think, as you said, we know that when people have that bub, they kind of goes many different ways, but quite often if they become unwell mentally after having that bub, so they become stressed or anxious because kind of there's this letdown of the emotional relief of getting through it, but then also the day-to-day parenting and the stresses that brings upon. There's often these feelings of guilt associated with, all we wanted was our first bub and that didn't happen. Now we've got this little bub and I'm not feeling great or connected. I don't feel attached to this baby, and this immense sort of guilt as a result of that, or this feeling of failure because I'm not being the dad. I missed out on being the first time and now I've got it and it doesn't feel right. That is something that many people experience, and that is absolutely a valid experience, and it's something that many people get through. But I think, there's also that piece around, wanting to honour and not fill the gap of the first loss with the new baby that you have, and you can't ever fill those losses. It's really important that you find ways, if that's what you feel you need to do, with building a way of memorializing, either actually or psychologically, that little person that you lost, and raising this new person as their own identity. And this new person doesn't know what was there or what they've lost or not had in their life. So I don't think there's a right or a wrong to it. I just think it's about allowing yourself the space to reflect on it, and do that sometimes with help if you need to. Piece of, there's no rule book. We know that there are stages to grief that people move through, but that feels, again, very different to everyone. And I think the more we hold ourselves to this, it should be here, the more we're going to struggle.
How common is postnatal depression?
So we know that 1 in 5 mums and 1 in 10 dads will experience anxiety and or depression during the perinatal period in Australia. But we also know that we're really bad at asking dads the question on how they're going in the health system. So it could be higher.
And that's the same story as men feeling like their feelings don't matter when they lose children during pregnancy. Certainly don't want to say that they're not loving everything about being a dad, or be seen to be complaining when they've been blessed with a child.
Completely. And, it goes even deeper than that. We live in a country where there's a history of people who are not well, not being able to parent their bubs because they're taken away from them, or, being in a space where they're considered, failures if they're unwell and not healthy and fit, and parents, grandparents wanting to step in. So we do have a sort of intergenerational trauma in this country where, people are scared of saying they're less than perfect because somebody will be watching and somebody will be monitoring that, and that's a very extreme belief, but it's there for people. And I think that it is really important that, we understand that absolutely every parent struggles, either physically, psychologically, or any other, ism in between. That's very natural. You can't take on parenting a bub and it feel natural and wholesome and perfect all the time, because it's just not valid. We know that, about 60% of dads feel like they're scared of being left with their babies because they don't know what to do with their bubs, because they haven't been trained necessarily, or taught necessarily, and the role of being a mum, feeding and those kind of things, is more intuitive than for a dad. So, it's a really complex time.
So dads can feel disconnected in that early phase when it's about the bond with the mother and the child and the breastfeeding, and very obviously the child's connection with the mum is massive and big with you as well, but it's more about the mum in that initial phase. That can be part of men feeling like, oh, well, what am I doing here, or what am I doing
Third
enough?
wheel.
Or, did they do? Yeah.
Yeah. And hang on, baby, but you've just taken my partner away from me. There's all this stuff I'm missing out on in terms of the relationship that, it just doesn't feel
Then
right.
you can't say that, can you?
Well, you might not be able to say it, but you can feel it, and you can, when you feel it, you can actually say that feeling's okay. That feeling's valid, because again, there's no rule. There's no rule book to being a parent, and there's no one in this world that can tell you how you should be. You could be different, but you shouldn't be, because we've got to go easier on ourselves.
What are some of the other things that people say when they present with postnatal depression or anxiety? What is the thought pattern that's distressing people often?
Again, I think it can feel like so many things. For some people, it's just that deep feeling of being a failure, and, that all my mates got through this. Why am I feeling this way? I must be broken. One of my clients once told me that he felt like a balloon that had been left on a wall after a party and then just lost all of its air, and it kind of just hung limply in this space that, kind of had got forgotten. And that always stuck with me, because I think, that sense of getting left behind, that sense of losing your place and your identity and your function is something that's really universal for people, especially when they feel depressive, or have depression, because, we know that that means that people aren't necessarily looking after their body as well. They're not necessarily eating and exercising or sleeping. They're second guessing every thought that they have and, really just want to block the world off and want it to stop. But for men who are off working and trying to provide and feel that that's the area they can feel, like they're functional, that's really hard.
Because is there a lot of men feeling like they have a child and then feel like I'm not good enough, like I can't provide the life that this child deserves, and then a lot of self-loathing around that, like I should have been in a better position to be able to handle this better and be able to provide better, and I haven't done what I should have done to do that. And can that be a common one?
I think there would be lots of men that are kind of going, yeah, that's exactly right. But I also think that that looks so different to many people. But intrinsically, when something doesn't go right in our world, we point the finger at ourselves, unless we're narcissistic or, of a personality type that it's all about others. But the majority of people, when something goes wrong, especially something that goes wrong that many people would say is just easy or looks easy, like parenting is made to look, then the first thing they're going to do is feel like a failure. And we hear that all the time. Men blame themselves and then they don't know where to turn, and they don't want to tell their partner because they want their partner to see them as their world. They want to appear that they're capable of everything because that's all we all want. But the reality is that we know from callers to our helpline at PANDA, and we deliver over 57,000 calls, per year. And we know from our mental health checklist online that dads struggle universally with the same things, and that is how to be a dad, what to do in being a dad, how to verbalize and speak about that experience of mental vulnerability, whether that comes from the grief and loss that they've experienced as a result of leaving their bub, or whether their mental vulnerability comes from having a mental health condition. They're struggling with that and trying to make sense of it, but doing it a lot more quietly than women are doing.
How does that pressure to live up to the ideal of parenting, being the parent that, again, sort of seems similar to the pregnancy piece, in that we get an idea from all sorts of sources in society of how it's supposed to be and how we're supposed to be and how it's supposed to feel. With parenting, how does that influence the actual experience of the reality?
Well, I think you can get so caught up in the shoulding and musting and the benchmarking that you're not living in the moment. And, I think if we go back to where I started in this conversation about the biggest vulnerability you experience in loss or mental vulnerability is that sense of identity. We know, and, it's a proven kind of fact that when you take on a new role, whether it's within your workplace or as a father, you only feel comfortable in that role. And if you think back to a workplace, for example, that may be a bit easier to reference, but if you think about that work role, you only felt good at that role having gone through some time there, having done some things that people said, hey, you're really good at that, or you did that really well, or, oh man, you've been doing this for a while. Like it takes this kind of positive experience. It takes others seeing you in a role. It takes others talking about
evidence.
Yeah. So I think it's really important to understand that, if you're doing the shooting and musting and kind of, or catastrophizing, and that is, if I don't get this right, I'm going to mess up this kid and blah, 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 if you're doing all of that, then you're not getting the actual evidence of how you are being a parent, and therefore your identity is not growing and becoming stronger as a dad. So I think really taking that moment to kind of slap yourself about a bit and do the hang on, I'm stuck in this kind of shooting and musting and crystal balling what this, what I should be like, rather than actually being in the moment and taking stock of the evidence around how I am as a dad.
No one knows everything about the job on day one.
Absolutely not. And you
Or
wouldn't
year
expect
one, or
that.
year 10, or
I know,
however
right?
long.
Exactly. And, that is the hardest thing, you would never expect that. If you changed industry and went into a new work role, you wouldn't hit the job on day one thinking you knew it all. So why do we do it when we become parents?
Raising a child's infinitely more complex than doing a job at work as well, so
Yeah.
that doesn't make things any easier. Because
Year
I
on
guess
year, it's hard.
I'm not there yet, but you've never been a parent of a 1-year-old before, and then you've never been a parent of a 2-year-old, and then it keeps going,
Mate,
and
I
the
tell you.
goalposts keep moving.
I know. I've got a 13-year-old daughter and she blows my mind every day because it's like you just can't expect the things that it throws up for you, both in reality but also psychologically, because you think about your own experience and what you were doing and, how you were parented or how, it's fascinating, this journey. It's really fascinating. But that is, I think, why you need to kind of stop and reflect on it and go easy on yourself because blink and you'll
Is
miss
this
it.
something that you practice what you preach, that you've gotten better at over the years?
I don't know. I don't think I'd ever say that I'm great at parenting. I think I'm good at being human and I'm good at kind of thinking about, the many ingredients that go into making the cake of life. So I think, I kind of am good at going easy on my child and myself. But yeah, certainly not a gun at it, that's for sure.
That'll make the rest of us feel better, at least.
Yeah.
I think that's it, though. I mean, there's probably some people who market themselves as parenting gurus, but
Oh,
it's not really a thing, is it?
no,
And yeah,
no.
there's
I
no one
just
out
don't
there
know how
who's
you
got it
could.
figured out.
No. And even, at PANDA, we pride ourselves on the fact that no one parent is the same. We don't practice, while we deliver perinatal mental health care, we don't practice in a universal way. We focus on the individual. We deliver person-centered care because every single call, every single minute of every single day on our helpline, you experience something different. There is no one parent that looks the same or feels the same. Experiences kind of cluster in the same way, and it can be universal, but the multitude of things we bring in our backpack of crap are, unique to every individual, and they impact on how we deal with the grief of a bub or our mental health.
We've seen a lot of progress, particularly in the last 5 years, relating to mental health awareness and acceptance in general. A lot more talking about it and many more initiatives and a lot more attention on it. This area of mental health that you work in is even more taboo than the general discussion. Is you feel as though your area of mental health is becoming more normalized and progressing, where there's people having more of these conversations and feeling less alone with it and better at coming forward about it?
Yeah, look, I think we experience more opportunities like this to talk to broader audiences and different kinds of audiences around men's mental health. And that has escalated for me over the last 18 months, which is something this country and, we and you as somebody who hosts these conversations should be really proud of. Like, that is really valuable. I think, when I reflect on, I've been in this role as CEO at PANDA for just over 5 years, and when I reflect on the change experience I have, I go back to attending pregnancy, baby and child expos, and I love to get sometimes into the state expos and be on the ground and hand out pamphlets in the booths. And I know when I first started this job, if we tried to give a pamphlet to a dad, they would be, whoa, no, or if we'd try, you'd see a dad sort of tagging along and looking a little bit lost, that you'd say, oh, here's a resource for your toolbox and, your partner might like it as well. And there was this real reticence about kind of taking that pamphlet and thinking about it, whereas now we have dads actively coming up and looking at the pamphlets and engaging with the content and talking about the fact that they know about, the fact that they can experience vulnerability. And for me, that's a really nice kind of example in the moment of this change that is sweeping this country. And I know it's happening across all forms of mental health for men, but there's still so much to do. And I think, educating healthcare providers to get better at asking questions without feeling like they have to have all the answers, and for us as organisations to think differently about seeking those and looking for opportunities to help dads and to seek support from dads, and also to screen dads so that we're getting those opportunities. We need to get better at that.
It was such an important service that you provide. And one of the examples of a service plugging a really important gap for people. And I'm glad that exists, and it's not just the case of, there's thousands and thousands of people experiencing this and they have absolutely nowhere to go and nowhere to turn to. And they certainly don't want to pick up a pamphlet or even be seen to be considering something like that because they're so afraid of how that might be received. So I think it's very positive that that exists and that the tide is turning and there's more of an understanding and more of an acceptance around something that just needs to be normalized because it's just another difficult part of life. So that's really terrific that you're seeing some positive movement with that, because we don't often hear too much about the positive mental health wise. I mean, we know that there's more talk about it, but we know those suicide statistics are still the same, and a lot of this is generational change. I'm seeing some positive momentum and cultural shift as well.
Yeah. And it's just so important that people understand that, they don't need to fear this time in their, parenting journey or their life journey, that bad things can happen, but amazing things can happen as well, and that there are services to support them. And, we as an organisation were founded on people's lived experience, and that lived experience, gives you immense strength in your life to get through so many things. And for dads who are stuck in loss, there will come a time where that loss becomes a superpower of understanding, of conversations, of, strength that gives them the ability to be self-compassionate and, there for mates. And I just think there's so much wealth to come from these awful experiences if we can get ourselves help and learn to get through them, and it is learning new skills, sitting and listening to those inner dialogues and kind of letting yourself go there.
And being able to hear those lived experiences from others who are like you when you're going through it, it is something that can really help, that we want to lean on, that we want to search for. We want to know that, we're not the only one who's felt this way, and we want to believe that it will get better. And I think for a lot of men, give me the actionable steps that I can put in place right now to make this fixed.
Yeah. Give me a pill, I'll take it. Yeah. And that it's hard that there's just not one. But, where I have worked with so many people in the grief space, in my private practice and, also in the work that we do at PANDA, that we, get to experience the fact that people do come out the other side. You come out changed and you come out with scars, but you come out the other side and there is things waiting for you on that other side. And, you just got to give yourself time and not be self-critical.
Stuff.
Yeah, of course. Calling 1300 726 306 Monday to Saturday. We're available 9 a.m. till 7 p.m. And, not having to feel like you have to wrap everything up into a bow or a box to be able to present it to somebody, and just pick up the phone, start somewhere.
Terrific. Thanks so much for all your time and your insights, Julie.
Oh, thanks for having the conversation. It's been so great. It's such an important area to sit in and be able to share. But don't do it alone.
That's it for this episode. If you like what we're all about, support us by following Young Blood Men's Mental Health on Instagram and Young Blood Mental Health on TikTok. Every podcast episode is recorded in professional quality video, and they're all up on our Young Blood Men's Mental Health YouTube channel. So please show some love and subscribe. You can find everything there is to know about the podcast at youngbloodmensmentalhealth.com. And most importantly, please share these stories with anyone in your life who needs to know they're not alone. We're all in this together. Catch you next time.